The earliest human activity in Highland region is likely to go back to at least the late glacial period, perhaps around 12,000 BC. But before we consider the people, it's necessary to look at their world. As you know, Scott Timpany is going to be covering environmental research later in the weekend. What I've tried to do is to produce a narrative account in order to provide an idea of the world that the earliest communities of the Highlands inhabited. And I'm grateful to both Scott and Richard Tipping for their work to draw together the threads of this and to try, probably unsuccessfully, to keep me on the straight and narrow. Taking the period of interest as covering the time period between about 14,000 and 6,000 years ago, the most important thing to consider is that this was a period of dynamic change. Those who lived in the Highlands would have experienced a world that was undergoing continual change in many different ways. Flexibility and adaptation were key to survival, based on deep knowledge and understanding of the world in which individual communities were a part. But it is important to realise that for them, change was the norm. Local archaeological studies of past environments have tended to focus on pollen analysis, perhaps because pollen was introduced early on, with the result that most archaeologists now feel happy when working with a pollen specialist. However, while pollen's an important part of this research, it's by no means the only one, and we do need to move beyond pollen. A number of other microfossils can be used to provide information on past environments. Insect remains, diatoms, ostracods, foraminifera. Sediment cores can be used to provide samples of these, and they themselves can be analysed to provide information, for example, through core scanning or the separation of ancient DNA. Other sources of information include isotope studies, which have been used as proxies for both rainfall and temperature. And various types of data come from work on cores drawn from the Greenland ice sheet and the bed of the North Atlantic. At this point, it's worth noting that while information drawn from further afield is undoubtedly useful in providing an overall view, when we're interested in particular communities or locations, we need to be drawing upon targeted, locational studies, which can take account of site-specific idiosyncrasies. In this way, it's possible to examine a wide variety of environmental change, including the developments of drainage and watercourses, climate and topography. With regard to the latter, relative sea level change is particularly important. The development of coastal topography and the landscape of Scotland is particularly complex, with much variation even across relatively short distances. It's important to note the influence of local topography on relative sea level change as well. This means that broad-scale models, such as those drawn up for, say, around the shores of the North Sea basin, these aren't suitable for analysis of the impact of this change on individual human communities. An offshore bar can hold back rising sea level for a considerable period after other adjacent areas have flooded, for example. For that, therefore, we need to undertake specific research targeted at particular lengths of coastline. And here, just to give you an idea of the sort of thing that's possible and the way in which you can look at things like the changing intertidal zone in one specific bay. While relative sea level change isn't generally an overnight disaster in human terms, it's also important not to forget the potential significance of individual events, such as the Storegga tsunami of about 6,200 BC. Returning to the broader history of environmental change and specific crisis points, this has been covered by several authors, and what follows is just a brief summary. The coverage of the last Scottish ice sheet provides a useful tabula rasa from which to start, and though precise details are lacking, the initial warming of the North Atlantic area is generally taken to have begun around 12,700 BC, though it should be noted that recently published models push deglaciation back to starting around 25,000 BC. This earlier warming, together with favourable precipitation, encouraged the development of biological productivity in, for example, soils and vegetation, and importantly, the sea. In many parts of Scotland, at the end of the late glacial, shorelines were higher than today, even though the fact that absolute sea level was around 120 metres lower. This is due to the impact of isostatic recovery, which means that the land, freed from the weight of ice, has also risen. At this point in time, Britain was still attached to the continent by the landscape of Doggerland, with the result that those who wished to explore the northern landscape could reach us on foot or along coastal seaways. It's worth noting, however, that this research suggests that those who occupied northwestern Europe at the time, they were much more at home among a gentler, lower topography. The emerging landscape of the Highlands would not only have provided a scope for exploration, but it took them out of their comfort zones. And as we know, these favourable conditions weren't going to last, and the onset of the Younger Dryas around 10,900 BC included a sharp decline in temperature and a return to glacial ice in specific areas. While the presence of ice doesn't mean that we should rule out human activity, it certainly made life more difficult, and survival required adaptation and flexibility. The current debate over the lack of well-dated evidence for human activity in Europe during the height of the Younger Dryas is telling. Mython and his colleagues have spoken of the way in which populations were drawn northwards and westwards towards the end of this period as conditions ameliorated. These marine landscapes and their associated archaeological material are well evidenced along the eastern shores of Doggerland, for example in western Sweden, and we have to assume that they existed to the west. We just need the evidence. This opens up the possibility for human activity in Scotland at this earlier stage, and indeed there are a number of isolated finds of Arensbergian-style tanned points. These occur on sites around the north and the west, and they're generally used to support this view. These finds will be dated approximately to the end of the Younger Dryas, I should say on stylistic grounds, and they occur, as you see, from as far afield as Orkney, Loch Torridon and so on. In Isla, at the site of Rutherport and Cellar, the evidence comprises more than one point. An extensive lithic assemblage has been excavated there, and this site's interpreted as evidence of the coastal penetration of northern Britain at the time. There must be more sites like this around. Around 9,700 BC, rapid amelioration of the environment occurred, and the Younger Dryas gave way to the period we know as the Holocene. During a period of relative improvement, albeit with oscillations, a marked deterioration has been recorded around 6,200 BC, and this is known as the 8.2 event because it's measured in BP terms. Within a few years in this period, temperature and rainfall both decreased and windiness increased. These poor conditions may have lasted for up to 400 years. Wickham and Mython have recently examined this event, assessing both environmental impact and knock-on impact on the human population. They note disturbance to vegetation, loss of woodlands, increase in sand lows and dune formation. It's also associated with a weakening of the thermal Highlands circulation in the North Atlantic, including the Gulf Stream. It's important because it means that those who lived in the Highlands at the time would have been compromised on two fronts, terrestrial and marine. In general, the Mesolithic lifestyle was flexible and adaptable. If a bad year meant a poor autumnal harvest, it could be made up by foraging in the intertidal and coastal zone. Only if both failed were communities really threatened. Wickham and Mython also note that these conditions, they're not just a threat to your food resources. Increased winds would impact on sea travel, with knock-on effects on mobility and probably mortality. They developed their research to include analysis of secure radiocarbon dates as a proxy for population in the west of Scotland. While it has its weaknesses, not least the fact that it's driven by the vagaries of excavators, it does highlight an interesting pattern, and certainly it's a useful way in which to generate discussion of the possible impact of this particular environmental downturn. And I've put on screen 3 models, which you can see very generally agree, but they're also drawn up across different areas. So I'm going to jump ahead, but obviously these slides are all available. And here's just looking at Wickham and Mythen's data from radiocarbon dates. So it's not surprising to find some differences in the models, given that they're drawn up across differing areas and the detail available varies, but the overall trends hold good. Now, this analysis is useful for ordering our thoughts, but it's also worth noting that the lack of similar densities of Mesolithic sites across the Highlands, this means that we just can't lift models like these into our area. We have to be really careful that we don't sort of bend the evidence in order to fit pre-existing paradigms. We have to look at our evidence for what it's worth. And actually, one of the big problems in Highland region is that we lack the sites to draw up models like this. This lack of sites is, in my eyes, one of the main research gaps which needs to be filled. The Highland HER lists 223 sites if you search for Mesolithic. You can narrow it down, though, to 43 if you include the word lithic. Whether these sites are Mesolithic or not, and many of them will be unproven, most of them are unexcavated. It's salutary to recognise that you can still count excavated Mesolithic sites in Highland region on the fingers and toes of one person. For this reason, it's misleading to map sites and single out significant or interesting sites. We're just looking at locations where people have excavated. Excavations such as those with the recent work, for example, on Mark, work I did many years ago on Brum, the sites around the Inner Sound, in Caithness, more recently the project at Taradale. These all indicate the range and type of evidence that can be obtained, but we need more of them. The work at Taradale highlights the rewards of targeted research and of amazing preservation that still exists. But why aren't we out there getting it? So the current distribution of material, as you can see, is very coastal. We need to examine the interior, including not just montane areas, but also gentler topography, glens and access routes. We have to remember that sea level change has skewed the picture. Intertidal sites such as Loch Duard, Hamastara, sorry, no, that's not intertidal. The site on Brazi is the one I mean, yes, this one. These act as a reminder that the sites that we find on land, they don't reflect the original resource. We need to do work in the intertidal zone. Furthermore, given that many sites manifest as lithic scatters, there's a need to improve how we record and deal with scatter sites. And this is something that we really haven't come to terms with, although I have to say that HES are now putting money into it over the next 3 years. But even once there's a lithic scatter strategy document drawn up, it still needs to be implemented. Recognising type fossils, do we really know what they mean when we're dealing with lithic scatter sites? Too often we quantify a site, we look at a site based on what we think the type fossils are, but we've so little data that this is really open to question. Now, I'm just going to run through really a sort of list that I've drawn up of questions, I think major questions that we could ask ourselves that are important. So, the origins and nature of initial colonisation. Mythen and others have noted the existence of tan points in the area, likely to be indicative of human activity going back to, say, 12,000 BC. I'd interpret this as relating to exploration and short-term activity spots as much as long-term settlement and colonisation. we are getting increasing evidence for this period. What's the nature of the world into which people are entering? How does it change over time? This is the original catch-all research question, and I quickly apologise to all my geoscientist colleagues for lumping them together in this way. It's impossible to study people in isolation from the world in which they live. It's impossible to separate out individual threads when each is necessary to weave together the whole. We need to move on from pollen-focused studies to a more holistic view. The technology's there, the specialists are there. We need to be working together. Equally, it's important to remember that while gross models are useful sort of pointers, if we're dealing with individual communities, we need specific data relating to specific areas. Do we see the influx of new populations within the Holocene? There are changes in artefact assemblages across this corner of northwest Europe. Though there are still few sites across the Highlands, we do see more sites than in the previous period. And I suspect that for well-rehearsed reasons covered in other publications, not least the original Scarf document, we've yet to find much of the evidence. Relative sea level change, coastal erosion, lack of intrusive development in much of the area, the ephemeral nature of sites, these are all relevant factors. However, this is the point at which the settlement of the Highlands becomes permanent and populations levels rise. The lack of evidence means that origins remain unclear, but current indications suggest that small groups moved in along emerging coasts and islands, probably coming from several different locations. In the north, there are suggestions of movement along the northern shores of Doggerland. Is there evidence for the transition in lithic technology between broad and narrow blade microids that is seen further south? Now, this is an important one because this transition is well documented in England, or at least English archaeologists think it is. Do we have evidence for this in Scotland? It's interesting because broad blade assemblages do occur in Scotland, but interpreting the evidence has been more problematic, not least because although the broad blade sites are supposed to be earlier in England and narrow blade sites later, in Scotland the situation is reversed. There's a suggestion recently that there might be a pattern of broad blade material coming in up the great river valleys, the Tweed and the Dee, for example. We need to do much more research on this. So we have got these assemblages, but we very rarely have them together on well-dated sites. What happens to the human population during the 8.2A cold event? And I just put this up to remind you that life doesn't stop when it gets a bit snowy. Bluntly, do the communities fail? Does everybody move away? This has been suggested. Riggs and Mytham suggest this and discuss a scenario of population collapse and people moving, in fact, across the country towards the east and towards the south. But it's worth noting that recent research in Greenland and Iceland suggests that where population density is already low, it is in fact possible for people to survive these downturns and to survive without sort of obvious archaeological impact. So we need to be looking at this in more detail, targeted research. What's the impact of the drowning of Doggerland? This is tied up with consideration of the Storegga slide and the tsunami. It's necessary, however, to avoid confusing the two and becoming too caught up in the drama of the tsunami being a major event. In contrast to this, the drowning of Doggerland took place over many centuries and is likely to have been much less of a threat to low-density coastal populations with inbuilt flexibility of lifestyle. Are Mesolithic communities focused on the coast? Do they penetrate inland? Although the existing distribution maps still show a heavy focus towards the coast, we are getting sites in upland areas. At the moment, the work of the Upper Dee Tributaries project, for example, has sites up in the Cairngorms from very early on. The coast was undoubtedly important, but much more work is needed in the highland areas. And also, we shouldn't forget that the inland isn't all about highland. As I said, that there are lowland environments there that need to be looked at. Can we refine interpretation of the Mesolithic economy? It's been particularly influenced by the idea that shellmins are a characteristic Mesolithic site, but that's related to the coastal bias and the prominence of sites like Oronsay, which I have to say are atypical and late. There's a lot more work to be done on this. Can we refine understanding of Mesolithic material culture? I think there's a problem in that. Most of the sites that we excavate are turning out to be very early. And I suspect that that's because we're identifying them from these sort of micras, from narrow blade micras. And we don't really know what happens to the artefact assemblages in the later period of the Mesolithic. So we're just not recognising and excavating those sites. And that, of course, brings us to the nature of the transition to farming. At present, the constraints of the archaeological record mean that it's still very difficult to recognise change. And in the Highland area, we're relying on information from out with that area. Again, it's worth noting that Wicks and Mython, they postulate population decline in the immediate centuries prior to the advent of the Mesolithic. So, you know, there's a lot of questions here. Now, of course, those are big questions. There's no shortage of small questions as well. And, you know, I think, again, one can break it down into smaller and smaller research topics. Now, the original Scarf Panel report identified a number of research questions, pretty all-embracing. None has been undertaken to the extent that it could be ticked off. Few have been addressed. And if I was to end on a political note, I'd comment that this isn't for want of interest. Funding is the big limiting factor. And the nature of funding has changed. Hunter-gatherer sites rarely qualify for developer funding, partly but not entirely due to problems of visibility. There's an over-reliance on HES. HES funding has changed. Research funding is particularly difficult to come by. So all this sounds a little bit negative. I don't think, to be honest, that we've really moved on from 2012 and the position we were in with the main Scarf report. We have got a few sites. We've got some fabulous projects like Taradale Through Time, which show that it's clearly possible to move forward, but we need more of them. Obviously, HLF is providing a source of funding at the moment, but I think we have to be aware as archaeologists that our sources of funding are constantly shifting. To end like this is to focus on reality as well as aspiration. One of my bugbears is the overuse of hyperbole in public archaeology. I'm not going to go into that here, that's a different lecture, but sometimes, however, I do think it's worth reminding ourselves just how special and worthy of study the archaeology of our earliest ancestors really is. Thank you.